Hello, everyone. It's good to have Neal Windham with us today. This is my first time meeting you as well, but we
Mm.
actually serve as spiritual directors for Renaissance, and Renaissance is a hub of micro church network. And I knew about you, but we never met. And so today it's the first time for me as well, meeting Neal. It's really good to see you, and I'm so thankful that you are willing to do this interview with me.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate you asking
Yeah.
and I'm really interested to see where this goes.
Yeah. Okay. Just out of curiosity, were you in different ministry before prior to serving as a spiritual director?
Yes, I came into ministry, oh my goodness, many years ago. I went off to seminary and paid for my education teaching Greek. So I didn't realize at the time I was becoming a professor.
Wow, Greek
Really, my
professor.
intention was to be a pastor and, professor, pastor at a Christian university. The great vocational hazard is I kept graduating my flock every 4 years, but the two go hand in hand. I have served a number of churches too, mostly in interim capacities, and
Mm,
uh, that's been a rich part of my life.
wow. Which school were you teaching?
I taught at, first of all, at what is now Mid-Atlantic Christian University down in
Hmm.
eastern North Carolina. 6 years there, and then a total of 34 years at Lincoln Christian University in Lincoln, Illinois.
Mm.
Mostly in the undergraduate school, but some in the seminary as well.
Oh man, it brings me back some memories about Greek when I was
Oh,
taking Greek classes
yeah.
in Gordon Conwell. Man, I suffered through that course. I don't know how I passed. Greek was so hard.
My students kept reminding me this is a dead language. Yeah, they seem to take some joy in that, but it is difficult. It's a challenge. I think it's as much a great servant of learning as it is of ministry.
Yeah.
Just a habit, of study and of coming to a place of mastery. But our proficiency levels in Greek as pastors these days, we're aided by so many computer resources. It's not like you have to open up a Greek New Testament and just read it.
Mm.
Yeah, hope it was helpful for you.
Yeah, yeah, of course, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. And then when you served as a interim pastor, I mean, your sermons must have been very in depth, knowing the Greek language.
Yeah, I've done some research on that. Back in seminary days, I just found 10 techniques that great preachers through history used for dealing with language issues. And what I discovered is you really don't have to talk about Greek directly in
Mm.
order to be able to convey what most needs to be heard. And I just think we need to work at it like any part of preaching.
Going from being a professor of Greek and interim pastor, but now you're serving more as a spiritual director now. Is
Mhm.
that the main ministry that you're involved in now?
It is. I formally retired from pastoral roles and professor roles. I think it was in 21. Yeah, 2021.
Mm.
And it was kind of a weird moment. I mean, I've still got my ordination certificate very
Mm.
prominently displayed in my study to remind myself this is not over. And
Mm.
it's been a journey figuring out what the next part looks like.
Mm.
Um, but what's happened is spiritual direction has kind of come to me. I think there's a hunger, especially among pastors. I mean,
Mm.
by a large margin, most of the people whom I work with are pastors or they're parachurch workers. So I think there's a sense in which, people who are serving in those roles are seeing the value and the need for this personally. it hasn't made it into the churches, at least in my tradition,
Yeah.
like I would hope to see it
Hmm.
flourish, among all God's people. But, uh, we're making some real headway among pastors, and that's where it's got to start, I think.
Yeah. But what is your tradition? Faith
Yeah,
tradition?
Stone Campbell tradition, sometimes called the Restoration Movement. This is a movement that was born early 1800s, Eastern Kentucky, Cane Ridge meetings. The Great Awakenings were
Mm.
taking place, and this was very much in the heart of all that. It's a movement that has really sought to unite God's people and in the process become itself divided, like so many unity movements throughout the history of the church. But Christian churches and churches of Christ, those are the churches I've served.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned a lot of pastors are coming to you. So I want to ask more about that. But before I get there, how did you come to practicing spiritual direction?
Is kind of a long answer. Let me just take you through my interaction with God through Holy Scripture. I grew up in a scripture saturated tradition. So, first 17 years of my life, the Bible is a symbol of God's presence.
Hmm.
I wasn't reading it a lot, but the 18th year of my life when I went to university, and this was 1973. I mean, we'd come out of the searching 60s and into the early 70s. It was a crazy time.
Mm.
The Bible became a catalyst for change in my life. I began to read it earnestly while a freshman at the University of Houston, and in time decided I at least wanted to go to Bible college or to a Christian university. So the next year, I went to Dallas Christian College, and I don't think I had determined that I would become a pastor. I was searching for God. I think the 60s opened up a kind of searching that happened long before there was an internet. I mean, we've been Googling for long before there was an internet. We've
Mm.
just been hungry and searching for answers. And so that's why I went that direction. In the process, I don't know, I just fell in love with the Bible. It kind of became the object of my scrutiny. I applied modern methods, modern hermeneutics, kind of technical stuff to try to answer all these questions as if I could, you know. And in time, I realized, no, that's not going to happen. So here's the short end of it. It was, I think, 1993. I was coming back from a Society of Biblical Literature conference in San Francisco.
Hmm.
Had picked up a book by a guy whose name I think I had heard, Henri Nouwen. He was a Dutch priest who
Right.
came over here and did some amazing things along the lines of spiritual formation. And God deconstructed my world that night. I mean, I
Mm.
just published a Greek textbook, had been asked to write another. I was thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? I need more education. I've got little children. And I read this book where Nouwen talks about his move from teaching at Notre Dame and Yale and Harvard to going to Toronto, Canada, where the L'Arche community is located, one of them, and working with people who had so just profound intellectual and physical disabilities, and he became their priest.
Yeah.
So that opened the door for me. He said, we're so tempted to be stars and to be powerful and to be,
Hmm.
what was it? He said, we want to turn loaves into bread. We want to be relevant, you know, and maybe the calling of a pastor is to be irrelevant, to
Hmm.
go to the
Interesting.
Word, to spend time in prayer, to do things which the larger society does not view
Hmm.
as relevant. So that just opened a whole new world of thought, and I began to read all kinds of spirituality literature. And so just to finish the tracking, I go from Bible as a symbol of God's presence to Bible as a catalyst for change to Bible as an object of my scrutiny to Bible as the subject of the scrutiny of me. and
Hmm.
my life. And that naturally led into a long pathway into spiritual formation and eventually to spiritual direction. Yeah.
Yeah. So Henry Nouwen was a big influence in guiding you into in 1993 towards spiritual formation. New kind of, I mean, not new, but spiritual formation. And then along the way, when did you experience what we call now spiritual direction?
Well, it was in reading now and that I began to read some books by Richard Foster, eventually David Benner and Alice
Hmm.
Freiling, and some of the other people who've written about spiritual direction. I thought, what is this? This is, I've
Yeah.
heard of this. It just wasn't part of my tradition, not formally. Anyway, I think there are people who are really great listeners who've been doing spiritual direction in all kinds of Christian traditions for a very long time. But I was just stumbling into it, and so I called the abbot at a local Benedictine monastery, and
Hmm.
Father Luis Gonzalez began to serve as my spiritual director.
This is 1993 still?
This would have been maybe 95. It was a couple of years later.
Okay.
Then I found out about a program. This would have been in the new millennium. I found out about a program of spiritual direction training at the Chiara Center, which is a Franciscan house in Springfield, Illinois.
Hmm.
And my wife and I jumped into it, and it became an extraordinary series of weekends, 3-day weekends of learning and kind of immersive experience and the practice of group spiritual direction, all of it leading toward a certificate in spiritual direction. I just sensed my students needed it. I needed it. There was at the time a growing awareness at the university of this need, and so we just jumped right in.
Wow. So you've been doing this for 20 years? Oh, no, 30 years?
More like formally, more like 20.
Wow.
I forget what year we completed that course of study. It must have been right around 2000. I did a DMin in spiritual formation after that at Azusa Pacific University.
Yeah.
Richard Foster had gone out there and kind of spearheaded that thing. And he wasn't there when I did my DMin. I
Okay.
regret not getting to study with him,
Yeah.
but that's kind of the tracking. And, my early work in spiritual direction was, of course, with students. That's why I did it. We teach in Christian universities for God, but it's always about the students. I just was seeking ways to help them kind of fill this void, this missing piece that they weren't getting in their formal academic training for ministry. And this became an invaluable resource in the process.
Why did you choose to be spiritual director more than, I mean, you served as a pastor as well, but it seems like you've been doing spiritual direction more than pastoring. Is that right? Or am I assuming?
Yeah, at this point in my life, that's
Yeah.
certainly true. Yeah.
Why spiritual direction over pastoral
Mhm.
ministry?
That's a great question. I have a deep, deep longing for the church to become acquainted with this resource. I've worked in very small churches. I've worked in at least one very large church and all in between. And I just see a need, irrespective of the size of the church and maybe even the different missions that we articulate, for people to work at forming a spiritual consciousness and ongoing awareness of the presence of God in every avenue and every aspect of life. I think ministry can be seductive.
Hmm.
Celebrity culture has infected it. Consumer culture has affected the church in radical ways that have pulled us away from the mission. Seek first the kingdom. Politics has entered in a way that really is disconcerting to me.
Yeah.
And so my longing was to help people develop what Paul calls this notion of unceasing prayer. Spiritual direction is really a prayer process whereby a director and a directee, and ultimately the director is the Holy Spirit, are listening to themselves and listening to each other, but together ultimately listening to God to help a directee form a much deeper relationship
Mm.
with our Maker. And so we look at prayer resources, we look at all kinds of practices that have been used throughout the Christian centuries, and all of it with a view to just enhancing a directee's awareness of God at work in every dimension of their life's experience.
So what needs do you think spiritual direction meets in pastors and Christians that is often missed in church setting?
Well, my sense is that the pastors that I know and the pastor that I've been are people whose lives are stretched thin and whose margins are slight. Something about the demands of contemporary ministry and the way people view pastors.
Mm.
Again, I go back to Nellen, who said, "Ours is the work of prayer. It's the work of the word, and it just takes time to be formed." Jesus told us to make disciples. I think that's the active work that we have been called to, and that's very important work. I mean, that's our mission. And if we were really doing that effectively, there's no telling. And if in every circumstance the church were doing that, there's no telling what difference it would make. But I think we labor at it sometimes because we haven't gotten to the other side of the coin, and that is this spiritual formation is the work of being formed.
Yeah.
It is not the active work of making disciples, but it's the work of posturing
Mm.
in order to be formed by the Holy Spirit. I'm intrigued that in Luke's language,
Mm.
both in the Gospel and in the book of Acts, he talks about being filled with the Spirit. He uses that,
Yeah.
it becomes a kind of technical phrase. So in the first chapter, it's used of who was it? Maybe Zechariah in the second chapter. Yeah, it's first chapter, being filled with the Spirit and speaking,
Mm.
and Mary being filled with the Spirit and offering this beautiful hymn, and of disciples on the day of Pentecost in Luke 2:4, of being filled with the Spirit and speaking in turn in tongues, and Acts 4:31, where the disciples are praying and they are said to be filled with the Spirit, and they speak up for God in
Mm.
turn. And that's where the discipling takes place. But the first thing is being filled with the Spirit. And
Yeah.
Paul picks up that same language. Luke and Paul are traveling companions. And Paul says, don't be filled with wine, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, and singing and making melody in your heart, and always giving thanks. And all of that's verbal. That's the discipling part that comes out of the passive work of posturing to be filled by Holy Spirit in
Mm.
order to speak up for God in this world. So I just think that's kind of the missing piece, and it requires
Mm.
environments
Yeah.
of spiritual formation. We write and hear and read a lot about silence and solitude. Those are necessary environments. Jesus
Mm.
practiced those environments. Sometimes we call them disciplines, maybe so, but I think they're environments for the disciplines of prayer and
Mm.
meditation, and of reading God's word and absorbing that word. And I just think we get so caught up with the programs and output and expectations of people and demands of leadership teams that sometimes we've slighted all of that in ways
Yeah.
that are really detrimental.
I love that you mentioned about environment, the atmosphere environment, and but also posture. And it reminds me of the, that Great Commission. I always wondered, since you're a Greek professor, maybe I can bring this to you and ask you about this. I always thought that, go and make disciples of all nations. I always felt like that was well, it's not that it's mistranslated. It's just like maybe we didn't quite capture the main posture of what Jesus is calling us to do. Because it seemed like to me it's like they've been already going, so it's like it's a aorist participle, right? It's like so
Yes.
since you've been going, as you go, in my mind, that's like, yeah, you've been already going. So as you go, instead of make disciples, I really felt like, no, it's like, it's the one word. So why did we make it into make disciples? It should be just disciple all nations.
Mhm.
And to me, like by saying make disciples, it seemed like now it's my duty to produce something.
Right.
Whereas it should have been just disciple all nations, because then that's a posture, that's a lifestyle to me.
Mm.
So I just always felt that way. But do you have some thoughts on that? Because I've been wanting to talk to somebody, and then you are the right person. Like, yeah, you're a Greek professor. Am I mistranslating that or
No, no, you're not.
misunderstanding?
It's been translated a lot of ways, and more often than not, it's that aorist participle is translated as an imperative. And there are a number of places in the Synoptic Gospels where you have aorist participles followed by imperatives, where it almost seems like they're on equal footing. I understand why that translation uh, came into being. But you're right, it's an aorist participle. And so literally it's something like after you go.
Yeah.
Some people translate it as you go. That would be a good translation for a present adverbial participle. But it's almost like he assumed they were going.
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing that's caught my attention is he kept telling them, I want you to go ahead and meet me in Galilee. Galilee was the hub of his ministry.
Hmm.
And, meet me at this mountain in Galilee where you can see the peoples, the bergs, the places where you'd be doing this work. So I think there was an assumption on Jesus' part that they would go and then that they would disciple. And you're right, I think it's an aorist participle, mathechusate.
Hmm.
Make disciples is how we translate it, but it could better be translated disciple because it is, as you say, one word in Greek. And
Yeah.
yeah, that makes some sense to me.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's why I feel like we kind of walked away from focusing on spiritual format becoming, right, forming. I think
Mm,
that is kind of being missed, because I think now we are more about producing
yeah.
somebody who can make more disciples. So I mean, for a while in church planting world that I was part of, it's always about produce disciple makers that will make more disciples and more disciples. So it just became a production or a manufacturing kind of thing. And so it's been more about like, are you going? Are you going? And then how can we make you go? And so like it's more about teaching that method of going out and so I feel like in that process we miss this important spiritual formation part, like
Mhm.
letting God's presence really let us become the true child of God, and recognizing that we're beloved of God, and that forms our identity. I feel like that's
Mm,
being missed, and then we're saying, no, 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 we got to love our neighbors. So we're putting all these commands out there and say, hey, we got to go, 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 and
right.
get more people to come to our church. And
I think about this passage in Paul, 1 Corinthians 3:6. Here are a couple of aorists. I planted, past simple action. Apollos came along and watered. That's our role.
mhm.
But then he shifts to an imperfect tense form, since we're doing Greek today. Shifts to an imperfect tense form, and I think it's what's called an aggressive imperfect to say God began to grow this thing.
Mm,
I planted, Apollos watered, and then God started the growth, and God is the one who's continuing to do that growing.
yeah.
So it's identity, yes. Role, Yeah. And I just think that in order to be in a position to plant and water, we need to know the seed.
Mm.
We need to know what we're working with. And that's where the work of spiritual formation and this posturing to receive from God the gifts of God in order to be able to pass them on is so vital.
So why do you think we assume pastors should be already kind of experiencing this kind of presence of God and they should be in a good place?
Mm.
Congregants assume that they're our models, and so, but why do they come to you to receive spiritual direction? And what does it say about the state that our pastors are in today?
Uh, so is the emphasis on why they're coming to me or
Spiritual direction to receive
why
spiritual
they're coming to me?
or
Yeah,
as a spiritual, yeah, like why are they coming to spirit to receive spiritual direction? Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I
yeah.
think there's a hole in the soul of America. I think there's a hole in the soul of the American church. I think people are realizing it. We turn to teaching.
Mm,
That's our Enlightenment heritage. Just learn the facts, buy into a very modern way of thinking. If we just have the right information, we can solve these problems.
mm,
And we've discovered that's not true. My generation really has been struggling with that ever since we were kids. Sometimes we look for coaches because I don't know how to do ministry. I mean, what I need to develop soft skills, interpersonal relationships, leading team meetings, all those things. And we get that coaching, then we realize, no, that wasn't everything I was looking for. And sometimes, we go to pastoral counseling, which is a magnificent resource. I just can't say enough good about that. But even the counselors have said this is not enough. I mentioned
mm,
David Benner a moment ago, his book Sacred Companions. He was a counselor. He is a counselor.
mm,
But he realized it wasn't enough. So he and a buddy of his got to looking into spiritual direction and became each other's spiritual directors. And they were just attempting to see how this could be another resource that could position them for more effective ministry. So, spiritual direction technically is not counseling, it's not teaching, it's not doing theology, though I've had directees who really wanted to do theology.
mm.
And we did some theology. It's not any of those things. It's old thing. It was born, I think, in the Egyptian desert with
Mhm.
people like Evagrius and Antony, who
Right.
left the kind of Constantinian church and the status quo church for the desert to
Yeah.
fight with demons in graveyards and caves. And 20 years later, people are coming to Antony saying, what is it about you? What have you
Yeah.
learned about God that we've been missing here? And I think it was a deliberate attempt to follow Jesus into the wilderness where he was tempted
Yeah.
and tested before he entered into this extraordinary ministry. It was a grand preparation for that.
Yeah.
And I think people are hungering for that. And, we need to get the word out. We really need to get the word out that these resources are available. And let me throw one other thing in here. One of the questions is how do we implement this in the church? Well, first of all, I think pastors themselves and staff need to find spiritual directors.
Yeah.
And they'll want to make sure they locate directors who are aware of and sympathetic to their theological identity and tradition, though they don't necessarily need to come from that same tradition. Some of the richest moments for me, anyway, in spiritual direction have come when I have worked with a director who was helping to form me from the riches of another tradition, Presbyterian, Catholic, Vineyard, a
Hmm.
wonderful spiritual director from the Vineyard Fellowship, Wesleyan directors and resources, Anglican, been extraordinarily helpful to me.
Yeah.
So I just think if we would avail ourselves to that, we would come into a place of appreciation and learning, and then could implement that in a church. Now, it's too big for a one-on-one implementation, in my view, which is why I'm going to recommend a title here by Alice Freiling,
Hmm.
Seeking God Together,
Yeah. I love that
which,
book.
yeah, it's an incredible book on group spiritual direction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Uh, so many times in life groups, the problem is there will be a very dominant personality. And, how do you deal with that when week after week they really want to kind of take over for the
Hmm.
group? And in group spiritual direction, every week, someone in the group will be focused upon and cared for and loved and especially listened to.
Hmm.
And we ask that person questions and we encourage that one person in the group so that, the person who wants to dominate is brought into a strange new world of having to listen to this person. And I think it teaches all of us the importance of how we can help one another on a very individualized basis. So that's how I see it getting into the churches, Dan.
Mm.
I,
Yeah.
I think it's I think it's going to happen at the group level, and then maybe we can begin the one-on-one kind of direction.
Yeah. But group spiritual direction is like quite challenging in for the facilitator because I think the facilitator needs to do it in such a way that everyone in that group learn to become a holy listener. And I think that's
Mhm.
right when they don't have that basic training or exposure to what holy listening looks like as a facilitator trying to guide them to become that person who honors the movement of the spirit in other people's story, like
Mm.
learning to sit and listen, not give advice. That's a really difficult thing to do. So how? Yeah, I really love that you brought that up. I think group spiritual direction. I really do believe that needs to be in church setting. But I'm sure there aren't too many spiritual directors in that church in the beginning. So how do you even go about making group spiritual direction more of a thing in the church? Because I'm
Yeah,
sure it's
yeah,
such a difficult skill to learn as a
it is.
facilitator. Yeah.
Yeah, and I am forever unlearning and learning in the process. I think we have to recognize at least a couple of things, how important it is to kind of be gentle with ourselves and continue to posture for the Lord's leading in showing us what this is and how it works. And secondly, when I've done this, I've offered some training for the group up front.
Mm.
Now, granted, that was my years as a college professor. I worked with a lot of small groups in college for the most part. So I've got a room with six guys in it. They're juniors and seniors. They're trying to discern what internship to take and
Yeah.
which ministry to step into and whom to ask out and maybe should I get engaged and oh my goodness, what does that mean? There's a lot of discernment,
Yeah.
which is one of the many arms of spiritual direction. So we entered into plenty of discussions about the wisdom of people like Ignatius Loyola,
Hmm.
who did some great work on discernment, and others. And I would train them up front along those lines. But the fact that we were able to kind of covenant together to be together for a couple of years, I mean, this requires in our case, a weekly, regular training grounds. So it really does require a focused and determined commitment of people. And I think you might want to ask questions up front about whether and how well, the members of the group are suited for this. Perhaps in one-on-ones before you form the group.
Yeah.
Um, just to kind of get a feel, it takes a pretty good bit of you mentioned the role of the facilitator. That's especially early on in group direction before the others in the group become facilitators. I would be the facilitator for 5 weeks at least so they could see how that looks.
Yeah.
And then in the sixth week, I would ask one of them, okay, what do you think? Are you ready to
Hmm.
give this a
Hmm.
shot? And we just have to be patient with each other and love each other and pray our way into it and out of it. And I can tell you the guys loved it. These, again, mostly juniors and seniors in college. The freshmen and sophomores, not so much.
Yeah.
And that brings up the point. I mean, people need to be at a certain level in their walk with the Lord before they're even receptive, I think,
Yeah.
spiritual direction and being asked all these questions. It's kind of intimidating.
Hmm.
Although one of our roles as facilitators is find ways not to intimidate, but
Yeah.
to ask the right questions, open-ended questions that allow
Hmm.
them to think and respond and with freedom and confidence, hopefully.
So when you mentioned about Saint Anthony the Great, back in that fourth century when people start to go out to the desert in Egypt, and I mean a lot of that is happening because of in my opinion, as a rebellious movement against the empire, like the Constantine made
Mhm.
Christian the state religion, and then that brought down a lot of the quality of the church. And then I tie fourth century to our 21st century. I feel like there's a lot of similarity that's happening, and I wonder. I feel like that's why we are now drawn to this contemplative spirituality as a way to kind of there's something wrong with the church and need to break away from this. So this is the question I wanted to ask. Like, back in fourth century, they left their urban setting, their cities, to go to the desert so that they can have silence, solitude, and all that. But a lot of people who don't agree with what's happening, Christian becoming powerful, and there's a lot of corruption that comes with that. The everyday believers today, they can't escape to the
Mm.
desert, but they want the presence. They want to experience this presence. And I think that's why spiritual direction is resurfacing in a way, or more of us are becoming spiritual directors because I feel like there's a need for people to want to experience the presence of God, the desert experience, but they're here, stuck here, or maybe stuck is too strong of a word, but they can't really escape anymore. So from your perspective, how do they practice being in this setting, yet still welcome God's presence? That desert spirituality. How do they practice that in this busy, 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 high demanding world?
Boy, great question. Several things come to mind. I'm fascinated with the writing of Philip Sheldrake, who talks a lot about urban environments and architecture and what they depict, the skylines and all of that. But in the midst of these urban settings, there are parks and there are kind of third spaces for
Hmm.
people to pause and reflect. And in some settings, you have to seek them out, but you find a labyrinth, find a church building, and see if there is openness on the part of the people who are in charge of maintaining that building to your going there to pray over the
Hmm.
lunch hour. Another perspective that comes to mind came to me from Albert Haas, whom I studied with. He's Franciscan. I think he's down in Colleyville, Texas now, who said, the great thing about Christianity is that with the incarnation, the Son of God joins us, and it makes everything sacred.
Mm,
His presence, just the presence of God the Son among us, makes sacred all space
mm,
and all time. And you know, if there were one discipline that I could leave with directees, it would probably come from Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. Practice the presence of God.
mm,
Or Frank Laubach, the missionary to the Philippines, same thing. All about practicing the presence of God. Brother Lawrence had read all these manuals of devotion and said, I can't keep up with that. We've got to keep it simple. We
yeah,
have to keep it very simple. So the question becomes, how do I practice the presence of God?
right.
Unceasing prayer in the midst of whatever environment I'm in, but here the urban environment. How do I practice the presence of God in the demanding environments of CEOs who are giving us directives that we can't seem to keep up with? How do I seek God's presence in the midst of that?
Yeah,
In the
people may
midst
not
of
understand what that means. Like when you say practice the presence of God, what does that even mean? Especially, for instance, like to make it practical, parent with young children. I mean, young children need you 24/7. You don't have space to go. They don't have that quiet place or quiet moment to pray or meditate on God. So what does practicing presence look like for busy parents with
a
young
parent
children?
with young children. I think back to developmental psychology. Eric Erickson said the first lesson you learn in life is trust. And I see that among my grandchildren. And I say, this is what God desires of us. What are the qualities, what are the attributes of that child that are godly? I can call attention to those that aren't sometimes more easily
Mm,
than those that are. I mean, but I'm just looking for God. It is God consciousness is becoming aware of the fact that God's presence permeates creation, and we are forever seeking to locate where and how and through whom and in whom that presence manifests itself. So when my granddaughter folds in my arms in a moment of utter and complete dependence upon Pappy,
mm.
I'm not God, but I see an image. Or I think of it this way. Psalm 131 is my favorite psalm.
Mm,
My heart is not proud. My eyes aren't lifted up. I haven't set my sights on things that are too wonderful for me, but I have stilled and quieted my heart like a weaned child in his mother's arms. And I remember the day my son, Luke, last nursed. He kicked and screamed and became red in the face, and there were tears all over his face. And I was crying, his mother was crying, we're all crying for 20 minutes as he's kicking and screaming. And I'm not a child psychologist. I don't know what happened, but there came a moment when he relaxed and he looked at his mother, and it just seemed like, oh, yeah, these are the same arms that have been holding me all along.
mm,
I've learned to trust this person. So let's figure out the next step. My daughter was like, okay, what's next? But my son, not so much.
mm,
And there was just, I think in him that moment of recognition. So just looking to see where God's at work and where the lessons are and where the moments
yeah.
are and where the scriptures come to mind, like Psalm 131.
Mm,
What are certain events in life? Which scriptures do they summon for us and apply for us? I don't know.
mm.
That's what comes to mind.
How has becoming a spiritual director changed you?
I wrote some things down earlier, and I forget where I wrote them, so I'll just talk. It's okay to be contemplative, you know, and Ours is a history of industry and progress and production and consumption and go, 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 go. It is not an age of slowing, and I've longed for that age. I've prayed for that age, but it's okay to be a contemplative.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean I'm not involved in what's going on in the communities in which I live and where I serve. I really have been. When I try to formulate a script for an MA in spiritual formation, there were four kind of pillars: habits, holy habits, which in turn lead to growth, which in turn really form a heart of compassion and caring, and uh, the other becomes paramount: compassion, justice, relationships. And all of that leads to a fourth component, and that's renewal.
Hmm.
It's okay to step back now, I need to see God in whatever environment I best connect with my Maker. For some people, it's one thing. For some people, it's another. And that too has been another of the lessons, just kind of a self-understanding along the lines of what we call temperament. I think there are spiritual temperaments, and people debate the Enneagram all day long. It's been helpful for me. It's really been helpful for me to kind of sort out a clear understanding of who I am. I'm among the nines, the peacemakers. It's interesting. I surveyed my classes in spiritual formation for several years, and I had 30 and 40 students in those classes. So while I didn't do any kind of formal statistical analysis of it, from year to year, I would discover that most of the people who are taking those classes are either twos or nines.
Mm.
Twos are being the kind of caregivers, and the nines are the peacemakers. But we also had people who were detectives, the fives, and the loyalists, the six, and the adventurers, the sevens. We had people who loved to be with God out of doors, and people who just wanted a beige wall. People who wanted candles and music, icons, and all of those things, many of which I'm looking at right now, by the way, sitting here at my desk, so you get a clue as to my spiritual pathway.
Hmm.
And just learning to love and appreciate the variety and the difference that exists, a vast range of differences that exist among people who long to connect with God and finding ways to do so. So yeah, those are some of the things I wrote down. Let me say one other.
Yeah.
I'm developing what I like to call a human hermeneutic. And by that, I mean we live in such a polarized age that I think we have become experts at focusing not upon what holds us together, but upon our differences
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
extent that it's just killing us. I mean, literally,
Yeah.
people are killing each other over these things now. And I have a great depth of longing for people to come to an understanding when they're reading texts of scripture or texts of life or just conversations among friends. What is it that holds us together humanly?
Mm.
Things like empathy and relationships. And Tom Wright had four of these big connectors: justice, relationships, spirituality itself. And I've forgotten the fourth one. I'm always looking for the connectors that will help me to and help others to understand what we have in common. We're all created in God's image,
Mm.
and at the same time, we are all very much capable of making life miserable for everyone. We've all
Yeah.
fallen. So just recognizing that as a starting point for having conversations with people about our need for spiritual awareness
Yeah.
and our need for God is
Yeah.
crucial.
I love that. Yeah, I feel like the Ibago Day, the we're image a bearer of God, and therefore the differences that we see in each of us To me, that's not the reason to hate one another.
Yes.
Differences are not to be hated. Differences are a gift to all of us. You know, if we're all created in God's image, if we see differences, they're there for a reason. Differences are, in my opinion, those are God's gifts for us to make our
Yes,
lives more fun and interesting. How boring it would be if we're all the same. So,
absolutely.
one last question. I know we're coming to an hour, but because you have such a unique perspective as a spiritual director, and you've done a lot of listening, practicing awareness. So, what is the biggest challenge that we are facing as church today, in your opinion, as a spiritual director, watching, observing what's happening in the world? Yeah, what
Mhm.
is the biggest challenge that the contemporary church faces?
I said earlier that I think there's something about pastoral work that's kind of seductive, and a lot of people have caved into that. I have
Mm,
at various points in my life and career. The whole celebrity thing is troubling to me. I don't think, in general, I don't think we're listening very well to each other.
hmm.
And so spiritual direction offers resources. If I were to frame it as a question, I would say, who's in charge here? I'm not in charge.
Hmm.
Lead pastors are not in charge.
That's
Academic
right.
deans are not in charge. Presidents and provosts, CEOs are not in charge. Just to be reminded who alone is sovereign. I think spiritual direction can bring us to a place of having to live with that wonderful, challenging reality all the time. As again, we learn to look for God everywhere. So, yeah, who's in charge? That would I would frame it as a question. Keep asking that question and being reminded we're
Thank
not.
you. That's a really great final word to end this interview on. Um, if people are encouraged by you and what you're sharing, and if they want to find you, they want to receive spiritual direction from you, how do they find you?
I don't have a website,
Okay.
and that's just been kind of a conscious decision, but I don't mind you sharing my email if that's okay. It's
Yeah.
RN as in Robert Neal Windham, Windham at Gmail.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I just this was such a fun conversation, and then sorry for being a little bit geeky, but I love talking about Greek, even though it was hard language for me, but I do use it still, and
Good. Yeah.
whenever I read a scripture, I try to get into the original text as much as I could. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom and your heart with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Dan. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.